at such a random time, 1 minute and 21 seconds. But here we are, only a little bit late. I apologize for that. My computer chose exactly this time of the day to update, and it's been 2 hours and it's at 90%. So this is going to be fun. I am your host, The Giant. Today I am gnomeless because Stevie's not cool enough to be here as usual. We've got some pretty awesome guests. So we'll start with my nemesis for the month, David Estes. Introduce yourself. Tell us about your
nemesis firing the first shot. I see. Well, besides being your nemesis, or arch nemesis as it may be, I'm David Estes, and I'm an author of a lot of sci-fi books and a few fantasy books. But lately, it's been all about Fate Marked for me, which is my epic fantasy series that I launched a couple of years ago and has been going strong.
How many words is in the Fate Marked series?
Oh, too many. I think I'm somewhere around the 1,000,000-word mark for the 5 books.
Nice.
Wow.
Very cool. Mine will be 1,000,000 in 6 books.
Oh, crap.
Nice.
You know what? I've just decided to add a second epilogue to the series. It will be 7 words.
7. Yeah, just a few more words than mine. Well done. Angel, why don't you tell us a little bit about your military stuff?
I'm Angel Hayes, and I have a Beyond the Shadows is a short story that's available on the website for free. And it's got military in that one. The other one will be a little bit less, but.
Very, very cool. It was a great story, guys. I read it. It's very cool. We'll talk about it in a few minutes. But Matt, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, Matt Gilbert, and I have a little series called The Sins of Fathers. It's a grimdark fantasy series, and one of the cultures that's involved are a highly militaristic culture, and it's much of the tension of it is about the conflict between people who are involved in that sort of culture and who are involved in a very corrupt sort of culture.
Very cool. And last but not least, Gene.
Hey. I'm Lowe Carlson. I'm the author of the Kingsman Chronicles epic fantasy series, and that starts with the book Black Mark. I think there are about 600,000 words for the 3, but eventually there will be 9 or more. So
she's challenging us.
Just
David.
ramping up.
My series is going to be 10 when it's finished.
Not at all a competitive group of authors. Well, David, seeing as you're the other author of the month, why don't you tell us about the Fate Marked series and a little bit about sort of the military aspects of it?
Sure. Well, this series, I actually recently got asked a question as to where I came up with my ideas, because it follows a cast of about 10 to 15 main characters to all different corners of this world. And my answer to that question was, I don't know where it came from. It just came from somewhere in my brain. And basically, it follows this kind of medieval ancient civilization as they struggle through times of war, into which a group of people are born with these kind of unusual markings. And depending on where they're born with these markings in this world, they're treated very differently. Some are worshipped like they're deities almost. Others are, considered to be evil, and they may be murdered at birth if they're not rescued. And so it kind of follows these characters with these markings that give them strange and unusual powers as they try to fulfill their role in an ancient prophecy, which basically says that these fate-marked people will change the course of history if they can survive. And so that was kind of the overall idea for the series. And from there, being the pantser that I am, it just kind of grew tentacles and turned into, as we were talking about, this 1,000,000-word epic, where at the beginning I didn't really know what it was. I didn't have any idea how many books it would be or how long it would be. So it's one of those kind of cool things where the characters were just living in my head and they just had to find a way out. And so that's what I strove to do in this series. And when I first launched it, I had seen a large dip in sales at that point, and so I really didn't know where it was going to go or what was going to happen. And I'm just so pleased that it's found an audience much larger than I ever could have expected. As far as the military aspect of it, I mean, this story, although at its core centers around these characters and their individual lives and the relationships they have, there is war throughout this series. It is a world that's torn by it, and many of the rulers, engage in war for evil purposes. Others do it for noble purposes. But I like to follow both the military leaders in this as well as some of those that are kind of supporting the military. Those who make, say, like the armor, the weapons, etc., so that everyone has kind of a role in it and a story to tell.
Interesting. Now, what would you compare it to, like in terms of real world military? Is there any comparison?
I don't know if there's necessarily a comparison, especially because I would say that in the end, while the normal soldiers do play a role, those who have the ability to change the course of these battles are generally those who have some sort of extra ability, whether it be because they are these fate-marked people that I alluded to earlier, or perhaps because they have been met by some kind of a curse or have some other event that has occurred in their lives which has changed their level of ability.
Interesting. So I guess we'll go with mine because I'm the other author of the month. Mine is all based on three things. Number one is the Viking style of fighting, which is just this full-on aggressive shield wall that charges right into battle. These are the bad guys. They're 7 feet tall at the smallest, so obviously they're a force to be reckoned with. Then the main characters, they fight in sort of a Roman legion style, not the third era of Roman legion. I don't remember the name for it, but it's the most modern, when they changed their formation to include centuries. And then these characters, these 7 characters, they operate behind the scenes like a special ops unit, like a modern special ops unit, but attached to this Roman legion style of army. So that was a lot of fun to play with, because then you get the ex Umbra operations where they're marching 1,000 miles to take a shot and kill the bad guy and then disappear into the middle of nowhere. Or you've got a pitched battle with thousands of men against thousands of men, and tactics based on Roman and more modern style of army. So that was a lot of fun to play with. Matt, what about you? We cannot hear you.
How about now?
We can hear you.
Sorry, I silenced my mic to be respectful to others. So the military aspect of my novels is actually it's more focused in one culture than the other. The central theory behind the entire series is a clash of cultures, as these guys are trying to deal with, again, an ancient prophecy. So there's a lot of ancient prophecies that go on in fantasy, I notice. In this case, the war is past. The war was fought 1,000 years in the past, and so these cultures they've diverged greatly, and there is intense mistrust between them because they are afraid of each other. They are not friends, and they have to find some way to work together in order to try and stop the prophecy, which is really bad. It's basically the end of the world, and they don't have a lot of information about it. So the militaristic culture, they essentially send a group of SEALs to try and locate and contact the other culture to see if they can find something, some kind of solution to what's going on. And things kind of spiral out of control from there because the other culture reacts very negatively to them. There are not a lot of pitched battles. We don't have, like you guys were talking about, like 1,000-man battles. What we actually have are a lot of small unit battles that are, in many cases, there's not even a lot of point in describing them because one group so overmatches the other that it's essentially a slaughter in a lot of cases. But conversely, the military guys they're not really prepared for the level of treachery and duplicity that they will encounter with the other guys. They're used to straightforward. Well, I don't like you, and so I had to beat you over, kill you. They're not really used to people who say, "What? Of course we're friends. We're going to work together," and betray them. That sort of thing.
Interesting. Does it have any real world comparisons? These two armies?
I would say the real world comparisons would be in the case of the military, in the case of the militaristic culture, Rome, like yourself, but again, small units. So they have like a century of guys who have been dispatched on a mission of importance, basically. And beyond that, the similarities would be I draw a lot from my own experience in the military as far as how they behave and sort of some of the crude language and humor and just general bluntness that the more militaristic guys express, which tends to outrage some people at times from the other culture.
Very interesting. Gene, what about you? Tell us about your military.
Yeah, so the Kingsman Chronicles books are essentially about two groups of people that have been fighting a shadow war for about 1,000 years. And it's gotten so out of control by the time the book actually starts that they don't really understand anymore why they're fighting. It's just they have this history of maintaining this power behind the thrones, essentially, and trying to annihilate each other in the shadows. So the book starts off with a group of 5 friends who are trained to be the elite warriors of the king, except a maneuver happens that ends up wiping out their all their people, like on one side. And so they go 10 years indentured into the military in service to a king that betrayed them, and they don't know why. And so the book starts and they're trying to figure out what happened to their people, how they all disappeared, et cetera, and also struggling with their own psychology of being a people betrayed and being pressed into military service to a king that betrayed them. And so there's a lot of psychological aspects going on there.
Interesting.
The world is basically medieval European, but the fights, like the fighting styles, I took a lot from like Shinbukan, which is traditional Japanese sword work, like with Kuroda Tetsuzan.
Mm-hmm.
I have a lot of friends who do like the traditional samurai style Shinbukan, and also study with like James Williams in California, and other folks that I know study with Vladimir Vasilyev in like Russian martial arts. So all of it is kind of like special forces based, but like how to eliminate your opponent with the least amount of like clash or aggression on your side. So like if you can stock up on them and get rid of them, without anybody else knowing, without them ever knowing, that's the best maneuver. So a lot of it is kind of the shadow warfare, but there are some really big battles that happen later in the books as they kind of, as kings and nations and entire armies end up falling into this whole conflict.
Now I have to ask, are these marks somehow related to a prophecy?
A little bit, yeah. The prophecy is kind of a loose one. It's more like it's hearsay that from something that someone engineered magically 1,000 years ago, but then magic was essentially like capped off in their world. So there's very little magic, and the people that still have it are the Kingsmen, who are like the elite fighters for the crown, but they don't have very much. So there's this tale that has changed and changed and changed, being passed down by word of mouth about somebody who's going to come and eventually be able to unite their entire continent and be able to turn magic back on again and undo what had happened 1,000 years ago. So it's less of like an end of the world prophecy and more of like unification, like bringing everyone to peace.
Interesting. So we are 3 for 4 with prophecies, guys. Mine have no prophecies. Angel, it's up to you now. Does yours have a prophecy?
Does it involve 1,000 years too?
Yeah.
Mine kind of does, but not in that way.
It's totally fine. It's cool. It's such an awesome trope. It's so fun to play with. But it's just funny how all of these stories have.
My next one will have 2 prophecies.
2 prophecies.
Oh,
Conflicting prophecies, and both will be true.
Culture people believe in one or the other, and they had to fight each other, and and a great war ensues.
So, Angel, tell us about Beyond the Shadows, right?
Yeah.
And the military in that one.
Yeah, Beyond the Shadows. The whole the whole 7K short is on the wall. It's kind of like the Great Wall of China kind of wall kind of thing. And behind it, they keep getting the shadow guards on the wall, and they keep having these strange beasts trying to attack it and trying to get through. And that wall surrounds it, and they're trying to get it so that they don't come into the human realm. So these guys, the shadow guard, are on the wall to try and fight them back. So because there's like unlimited amounts, and they have no idea where they're coming from, and it's all like a shadow is completely like in the sky. It's just kind of like an ink blot across. Like there's no sun, there's no stars, there's no moons. It's completely darkness, and no one knows why, and no one knows where these beasts are coming from. So the Shadow Guard are fighting all these beasts because the king sent his best men, and none of them come back. And in the story, then the battle mages, a small group of them go in, and they barely make it back alive.
Interesting. Now, did you say the wall was around this inky darkness, or it's like blocking, or it's protecting the kingdom?
It's protecting.
Okay.
So it's kind of like that, and then everything else, because there's the human realm, and there's the mages and everything all beyond it, and that's why they can't afford a breach. They've had a breach, and it did not go over well. But yeah.
Interesting. So like I would say one of my biggest complaints about Game of Thrones, of which there's going to be many, was the whole battle at what's the name? It's Winterfell, right?
Winterfell, yeah.
Right. Is that there's this massive countryside, and the army all happens to be funneling into this one little, like right towards the city, right? Without the united humans doing anything to draw them in. So they got past this wall, which I can conceivably see the wall running from coast to coast. But once they're past this wall, they have this massive continent, and they all happen to funnel right towards Winterfell. So there's that degree of unrealism, however you want to call it, that for me was like, it started off ruining the episode, which obviously went on its merry way and continues.
That's the one where they left their comfortable, safe fortifications, went out, charged the enemy, and got slaughtered too. So.
In the darkness.
Exactly. So
the battle tactics were horrible.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. So, but I, like if your wall is like the Great Wall of China worked because it stretches for so many thousands or hundreds of miles, and then the terrain plays with it, and the Mongol hordes they could go around, but it wasn't worth it for them to go around. Whereas for the Shadow Spawn, is there a way to get around, or is it only one way through the wall?
No, there's only one way through because it's on like the end. Hold on. Like this is all water.
Okay.
And so the wall is here, so there is no way around.
And they can't swim.
Well, I haven't created swimming like that.
Sorry. This is the kind of critical analysis that went into crafting my own stuff. And there were times that I had to no, I'm just going to futz this a little bit. But most of the time it was that super nitpicky stuff. David, when you were writing yours, were you like nitpicky like that? Or were you just like, I'm going to tell an awesome story?
Well, given the length, I'm sure it has many holes and flaws. I'm far from being a perfectionist, but I kind of had some core principles in my mind, and I had some key events, and I knew exactly how I wanted my characters to get from A to B. That being said, I had a very strong group of beta readers, some of whom I would say are plot hole experts. So they pointed out a lot of them, including some type of things that you're alluding to, where things got a little bit unrealistic, where a character, let's say, would turn from somewhat mild-mannered and peaceful to raging and evil and going on killing sprees and that sort of thing. So let's call those the rough edges of the story that hopefully were smoothed out during the revising process. But I do have some characters that go from pretty much mild-mannered and peaceful to extremely evil, and then hopefully by the end they become fan favorites.
Now, did you do research into sort of military type people, or have you any military experience, or how did you write these military characters specifically that feel and read as real, genuine soldiers or warriors?
Nope. And nope. I'm one of those authors who is not a fan of the research. So anything that I need to basically, any gaps I need to fill in, I tend to just do it by just inventing my own stuff. So as an example, I have one of the areas that tends to get noticed and mentioned in reviews is this forest that has sort of some interesting, let's call them, I guess, some kind of, I don't know what you call it actually. It's kind of like just some principles related to, I guess, what it's made out of, which is this liquid or iron ore type material. And basically those who are native to this area have the ability to control this liquid ore and use it to craft their own armor, their own weapons, and their own cities, so that actually the city itself is made from this liquid ore. And those who are able to control it, who are the ones that just are more in tune with it through natural genetics, they are the ones who then can, during the course of a battle within this forest, control the ore. Like, let's say, take a branch from one of these ore trees and turn it into a spear that then flies and kills some enemy. So they can use that kind of natural magic that is just native to where they live. And so obviously there's no real world equivalent to that sort of thing. So I just would kind of use my imagination to make things that are a little bit more interesting. And they've essentially made their stronghold kind of impervious to attack because of their ability to control the forest and the world around them. But then what I like to do is make things a little bit interesting and give them reasons to potentially leave their stronghold where their magical abilities suddenly are of no value to them. They still have their, fancy armor and whatnot and their weapons, but to actually then change them in the midst of the battle, they can't do that outside of their forest. So that's what I tended to do in my stories was go a little bit more just creation wise and create my own world rather than drawing on necessarily any inspirations. That being said, clearly when it got into certain, let's say, characters who traveled by way of seafaring vessel, ships and whatnot, I had to do plenty of research there. I got, out of my comfort zone and had to do some research there to at least get some realism into my world so that I wasn't making constant errors where those who did have the knowledge would then say, this guy, he doesn't know what he's talking about.
go to the right side and then the left side of the ship, things like that.
Port, I don't know. What are all these different terms? I learned them on the fly, but then I kind of discarded them after.
It's actually for that reason that I've refused to write any ship stuff yet, just because it's going to take so much research to get all of that kind of stuff, depending on the vessel that you're talking, whether it's sails or rowing or, how big, how many sails, what the shit you do with sails, things like that.
I'll tell you how I solved that problem. The viewpoint character is born and raised in the desert and has no clue what is going on.
But the characters around him have to be competent. So it's like when it's like the captain says, all right, a storm's coming. No one's just going to sit around and say, okay, like they got to run somewhere and do something. What is it that they run and do? What are the ropes doing when they're pulling on them? Or, that's the kind of stuff that's going to take a lot of research to get right for those of us who have zero experience with sailing. So it's why I've refused to go that route yet.
Send it to people who know.
Yeah,
I feel like this just watch a lot of Master and Commander.
That's true. Or
Horatio Hornblower.
I actually served on ships, and I still don't know a whole lot of that stuff.
Yeah, that's another one actually with space. Like space combat and aerial combat. Well, for Magic, for fantasy with dragons. I tried to do a flight simulator. I did a flight simulator at museum, the Aerospace Museum in San Diego, and I was so garbage at it because I could not understand, the Y and the X axes. So I was the worst. I was trying to, do a dogfight, and I couldn't even kill one of the enemy planes. So trying to do that, you watch Star Wars and stuff, and everybody's coming at each other like this, straight on, head on, and it just doesn't make any sense to anybody who knows anything about the three dimensions of space. So some of these things are a little bit too far for me. Matt, so you drew on your experiences as a Navy man to write these characters. What do you think was the thing that you drew on most?
I think just the personalities in general. I have certainly lived any number of days living in barracks or shipboard, so I have a pretty firsthand knowledge of how interaction goes when there ain't no civilians around. And the banter tends to be quite crude and would shock some delicate sensibilities, to say the least. And I may have included a few of those things in some of the behavior there, so that shocks some delicate sensibilities.
Nice. Nice. Gene, what about you? What did you draw on to make your characters feel? Well, because yours aren't like proper soldiers in the sense they're more like special operatives or almost more like spies was the feeling that I got from them, like more CIA type.
Yeah, I mean, they have a lot of skills like with sword, bows, knives, all that kind of stuff. And for that, I drew from, the Japanese sword stuff and HEMA and, just like this idea of like conserving your energy when you're fighting so that you can continue fighting like long past when everyone else is dropping to the earth. But they're definitely more of special ops type folks. Like they were trained to be the elite warriors of the king and peacekeepers. So they would go in and settle situations, sometimes quietly, sometimes at the head of a battle, sometimes slitting throats in the night. So, they sort of have all those skills. But as the characters progress through the books, you get to see them use that in different ways. Like one of the main characters gets into like an assassination fight like right away in the book. An assassin comes after him while he's sleeping. And so they have this really intense struggle where he's like naked because he was sleeping, and they have knives because they're working in close quarters, and it's slippery, it's disgusting, there's blood, crap, and piss, and it's for real. And that was the stuff that I really consulted these folks that I know who know a lot about special forces fighting and have been involved in that kind of training, because they were like, knife battles are really awful. Like you get swiped many, many times, you're bleeding out everywhere, cuts everywhere, bowels and all this kind of stuff. So it's not pretty or fun. And I think that kind of pushed my books a little bit into the grimdark area also, because people were like, oh my God, this is intense and disgusting.
that makes it real though.
Yeah.
I think any realistic analysis of chopping people open or stabbing them with with a melee instrument is pretty much going to be pretty icky. It's going to go grimdark at that point.
Yeah, totally.
Did any of you guys write sort of the aftermath of the battle, like the immediate aftermath, where there's still all of the wounded on the field, and then there's the dead on the field, and the people who are dying, and sort of everything that comes with that?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a big part of the battle scenes that I've written, because there's fallout that affects the characters based on those events too, like based on how much wounded there is, like what they have to deal with in the environment now that it's all like all the terrain is just soaked in blood, and infection, all that kind of stuff.
Interesting. David, what about you? Did you get into all of that?
Yeah, definitely to some degree. I mean, over the course of it, everything is seen through the eyes of these various characters, but I am not purposely going for shock value at any degree, but I do go for realism. And when there are battles, characters are going to die. And I mean, there are plenty of main characters that die. And I've gotten a number of messages through social media that said, "What the heck? I hate you. You're my least favorite person. You killed my favorite character." But I loved your book. So that at the end, that's what keeps me going. And I know I did it right if I get that kind of a reaction. But it's not that I say at the beginning of a project, this character is just going to die. It's as I'm going, what feels like the ones that are meant to, for whatever reason, which generally involves moving other characters' arcs along, changing characters in a way that they need to be changed. But I don't shy away from that. At the end of the day, if there are dead and wounded and dying, then that needs to be told too, and their stories need to be told too, even if it's an abrupt ending.
Yeah. Yeah, for the Silent Champion series, one of the characters that I wrote in was there specifically to die for a reason. But then the rest of them, it's a team of 7. You can't have all 7 walk out alive. So but up until like nearing the end of book 4, which is sort of the last book in the series, I didn't know who was going to die until like I was getting to the ending, and there were just a few things that some of the characters did or said in the time leading up to that big last clash that made it just made it the perfect way to end their story right there, as opposed to having them, be wounded and lose a limb, or incapacitated, unable to fight, or survive totally. Like it just, I think like you just get the feeling of when the character's time has come.
Man, every time you say that, I don't want to think about who's gonna die.
I kind of go through a little bit of grief on the occasions when I end up taking some characters out, and yet as Andy just pointed out, you have a sense of when it's the time, and to shy away from it will make it not as good a work.
Yeah, if somebody has like a redemptive story arc, that the best redemption for them is losing their life while they're going, saving someone else, or bringing a clash to its final point, then they gotta die. They gotta die. But it is sad. Like, I ended up crying when I was writing the death scene of a main character in book 2 for me. I was just bawling, and my husband was like, what's going on? Like, what's wrong? And I was like, I had to kill this character.
Yeah. That's something that has never happened to me until the Silent Champions book 4. I wrote the character's ending, and it was just like it really hit me that had never happened before. In all the other times that I've killed off characters in all of my other books, that was probably the one that hit me the most. Maybe because I had spent so much time in this character's head or telling their story. And I think truly that's what makes the death so meaningful for us authors, and then of course for the readers, is because you've lived with this character for so long. I mean, it's 4 books, 800,000 words. That's a lot of time spent with these characters. So when they die, and especially when they die in a way that has meaning, that actually propels the story forward, or that resolves their personal arc or whatever it is, that's when you get that sense of loss, of profound sadness, and yet not anger at it, not that it was done incorrectly, but because it was done the right way, that it was their time, or it was their way to go.
Right, and those characters represent a significant investment on your part as well. So you're loath to sacrifice them and remove them from the story unless there is a big payoff for it.
Yeah, so like the one I'm writing right now is called The Last March, and it's basically 300 meets the Chain of Dogs from the Malazan series. And it's just every single one of these characters that I'm writing is going to die, because that's exactly the story that, everybody knows from the rest of the series, that there's this last march of the Ninth Company, and they all end up dead. So you're writing this story with the knowledge that every single one of these characters needs to either get a great ending or a terrible ending. One of them is going to be dragged off by the enemy, and he's going to be, staked out there for, to psychologically torture the other survivors, or, so it's really, I think that's part of what's making this book so difficult for me to write, is because I know that I'm going to have to kill off each of these characters in a very meaningful way, whether, a good meaning or a bad meaning. I have to ask, I studied a lot of tactics and military strategy to write my series. Did any of you do that as well, or no?
Yep. Yeah, I have unorthodox strategies. That's what I really like. There's that one, and then the turn around and run like hell, especially like Chinese ones.
Interesting.
Cool.
Yeah.
As for me, as I said, a lot of the battles that I actually have happen are between groups there's a great disparity in skills. So it tends to run like modern gunfights run. There's one side is quickly dispatched and the other side is not harmed over much, not unless they're actually fighting people who are of similar skill. So, but essentially the stuff that I do go into detail on, I treat it like gunfights. It happens really quick, almost before people can figure out what's going on, and people who aren't highly skilled can barely even follow what happened. The guy who's very skilled knows exactly what he's doing. He knows his target. He makes his strike, and unless he's fighting somebody who is of very good caliber, that strike lands and the fight is over.
Interesting. David, what about you?
Still no. I mean, I kind of really write by the seat of my pants, and I'm a very visual person, so I draw more on probably pop culture and the movies that I've read or I've watched, and the other books that I've read, and those which felt the most realistic. I mean, some of that stuff is clearly always going to be a little bit sensationalized, but the ones that feel more realistic, I try to draw on those inspirations, and I guess I try to picture it in my head as best as I can, and I tend to get comments that my books feel like movies or TV shows and things. So I guess others can kind of do that the same. So maybe it is that visualization kind of bleeds through onto the pages a little bit.
That's how I kind of do things too, David, and I think it works very well, because I think one can become like too focused on the actual mechanics to the point that it's difficult to even get it across to a reader who's like, they don't necessarily know the term for some specific move in the first place. What they do know is, okay, this guy, he stabbed this dude in the throat and then that killed him, right? So those are, for kind of a visceral writing at that point, I think actually trying to be too technical would probably injure or damage the quickness that you want to try and do in the battles and stuff.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Matt. Like sometimes there's this, like you have pacing issues to get across of like how quickly something is happening in a battle, or you want like an aerial view, or you want like a real close in-person view of what like one character is doing to another character. So sometimes you can't write in all those details because you got to capture the gist of what's going on.
Right.
Well, let me ask you all this. How did you find that balance between the sort of the aerial view, like the captain's view, the general's view, and then really pushing in and getting that not blow by blow, but like right there in the middle of the action? How did you find a way to do both? David, I assume you just wrote like 8 different characters that each of them were in different places in the battle.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to take my characters similar Game of Thrones style. I mean, it was a huge inspiration for me. I loved the idea, and I mean, this certainly turns off some readers who want you to focus in on 1, maybe 2 characters and get in depth. I attempted to go kind of in depth and get to know 12 to 15 characters and just have them go on all their different journeys. But what always tends to happen is by the end, the majority of these characters are then their paths are crossing, interweaving, and they're ending up in some epic battle. And so when I tell these battle scenes, I go from the chapter having 1 point of view character to the chapter having, like you said, 8 points of view.
Yes.
And I just have to kind of separate them as I go. And some of these snippets may be a paragraph or 2 from this character's point of view. Other ones may go on for a couple of pages. And so, I mean, that really is how I did it. Just boots on the ground. These are the people that are living this with different roles in the battle. Some may be to protect one particular person. Another may be they're the bull that has to just break through the enemy lines and cause chaos. So the other one may be someone who comes from the southern lands where they have dragons. And so it's a dragon rider. And so you get to kind of see all their different perspectives as it pertains to one battle, which I think is kind of cool because it gives more dimension to the battle rather than just 1,000 people hit 1,000 people and chaos, ensues.
I totally support that method. That's the method that I take in any large battles that I did. Maybe I maybe had one with like probably about 200-ish people or something like that. It's it doesn't matter, I don't think, or to the reader that overhead perspective, or at least it doesn't matter to me if I'm reading, right? What matters to me is what is the character that I'm following thinking, and what are they perceiving? And if you, as you say, you're cutting between scenes, okay, this is happening to this guy, this is happening to this guy, and the reader is going to get a general sense of things. Ideally, they'll then be able to predict, okay, maybe this guy is going to have to deal with the aftermath of what was just happening to this guy because it's kind of headed his way, that kind of thing. I think that's about the best way to handle that kind of thing.
Interesting. What about you, Gene?
Yeah, I kind of do what David does. I like the books that I read are also George Martin style, so they've got like 8 major characters. That the story, it alternates chapters, so you get different chapter perspectives. So a battle might last for 2 or 3 chapters, depending on like how many phases it goes through, or if there's any sneak activity happening the night before, that kind of stuff. So you get to see it from different character perspectives. And then like a different character might see like the aftermath of the battle if they arrive on the scene late or something like that. So you do see it. Each person has their own individual take on what's happening, but it's not all the people in the same chapter. It's like it's spaced out a little bit more.
Interesting. Angel, yours was a single point of view, right?
For that one, yeah.
For that one. So you got, I like that perspective. As I was reading it, I was hoping that he would like tie a rope around his waist and like jump off like from the movie The Great Wall. Even though that was terrible tactics in the movie, it was still hella cinematic.
Yeah, it's cool.
I was hoping he'd do something like that. Then he didn't, and I was a little disappointed by the realism of it all.
Wow. No, my other books do, because these ones I haven't written battle scenes for yet. Just the gladiator stuff, and then my editor just gets on me. He's like, if you're doing it from him, he doesn't see that, so you can't include that. I'm like, oh. But my other ones, that series that's coming out in a couple of years, it's I like doing it from the bad guy's point of view too, and I go back and forth. I only have a few, maybe like 4 point of view characters, but I really like seeing it from the undead point of view and all that too. Well, not everything has to be heroic.
I love that. I love that, and that's something I've often played with in my stories, doing the villain point of view. And in Fate Marked, it took me a while to get there, but I eventually, after realizing who the super villain was going to be in this story, I went back and wrote like a origin story. I wrote origin stories actually for all of my characters, so I offer those as kind of some added material. And so for this one, I wrote an origin story for the super villain and how he basically went from a crippled prince to then the villain of this story, who basically commands these hordes of horrible creatures. And just going on that journey, I mean, I wanted readers to understand the why. I don't want this to be just I'm bad because I'm bad type of a situation. I wanted there to be a why behind it. So I like that, Angel. I like that you play with kind of the villain's point of views too, so you can kind of get inside their heads, even if it can be a little bit scary sometimes.
It's real.
I kind of don't have people who are specifically the obvious villains in what I'm working on. I work like with a lot of you guys have talked about a number of characters. So are we calling it the Martin style? But I try to depict them all as, they're basically sane and they figure that they're doing the right thing and that they're the good guys. So the conflict arises from people having different decisions and different priorities. And I suspect if you had a few people lined up and said, who are the good guys and who are the bad guys, I would get a whole lot of different answers there. That's the goal, actually.
Yeah, I was going to say that should be the goal for something like that.
Well,
yeah, all the villains want to believe that they're right. They think they're right.
Yeah. Well, that makes a good villain.
In Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People, he talks about that, there never was a bad guy who thought that he was a bad guy. The bad guys always think that they're the good guys and that they're misunderstood or other people push them into things. So that's something I try to keep in mind when I'm writing guys who I think are bad guys.
Yeah.
Very, very interesting. So, do any of you guys have questions, or does anybody in the viewing audience have any questions for these authors? Take it away.
I want to know what's your favorite military story, your military
Mine?
book.
That's
Okay,
tough.
it's not all about you. I said that.
Okay. Well, I wasn't sure who you were talking to. I'm going to take it as being directed to me, anyways. So there are three that stand out to me. There's the Rainbow Six series by Tom Clancy. I love those ones. Like that was when I first started reading, so I was very new to fiction in general. And then I get these badass soldiers who go around, do awesome missions, and shoot people with guns. I think I was about 15 or 16 at the time, just right in that sweet spot for young men who like that kind of stuff. So that for me was just, oh my God, I blew my mind. And then the Black Company, which is soldiers / mercenaries.
Yeah.
That one was so fun. Just the camaraderie, the dynamic between the various characters. That was a huge influence. Both of those were a huge influence on. I mean, you can see it by the fact that it's the Black Company, they're sort of independent of the army, and Rainbow Six, they're elite warriors. You put them together and you have the Silent Champion. So, and then the Bridge Burners from Malazan Book of the Fallen.
Yes.
The series overall was a little bit harder for me to digest, but every time he zoomed in and focused on the Bridge Burners story, I was there for it, 100%.
I'd put forth Dick Marcinko's Rogue Warrior, which is
Yes.
non-fiction, but it's a really great treatise on small tactics and kind of the special forces mindset. Where I was talking about grossing people out earlier, there's actually a scene where he said they would clear tables by spitting a loogie into a cup and passing it to one of their friends and having to drink it, and people would just get up and leave so they could all sit together when they were at chow and stuff. So.
That's funny. Yeah, I read one of his books. It was one of the fiction ones. They were a lot of fun. David, what about you?
I mean, I love the Stormlight Archives, Brandon Sanderson. It probably gets mentioned all the time, but I love the way, and again, it's very, to me, even though there's a lot of military action and military activity in the books, it centers on characters and the relationships. And I just love how he creates these interesting settings where you've got these chasms and these chasm fiends, and they're trying to dig out the hearts. And it's like this kind of battle within a battle between the different companies, all trying to become the best company, and almost ignoring, at the expense of ignoring the so-called enemy that they have. So to me, that I just find it extremely interesting the way he plays with that sort of activity. And then I guess just kind of pulling at the heartstrings, I really enjoyed the movie The Patriot, partly because it brings a historical perspective into the country that many of us live in, and just the way that they portrayed it from a single character's point of view, in some cases witnessing atrocities and very brutal scenes, but still managing to have heart, at the end of the day. So those were two that stand out to me as really enjoyable military pop culture.
I just thought of another one I would add. Do you guys ever read David Ranks of Bronze?
Mm-mm.
It's about a Roman legion. I think there was like a real Roman legion that went missing like way back.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
And they're captured by aliens, and the aliens have laws that like they can't just laser down the primitives on planets, so they have to meet them with some kind of similar technological advantage. So they capture a Roman legion to go down and beat the crap out of the planets that they want to take over and exploit. It was pretty harsh. It was a very good tale.
David Drake, you said?
Yeah, and it's actually famous enough that there have been a number of authors who wrote like follow-ons to it. So there was I'm trying to remember what the other one was. It was they took British, like from medieval times soldiers.
Oh yeah, 1649 or something like that.
So but this was actually supposed to be like the same aliens and stuff. So there were some other authors picked up in that world and wrote. There's another book and some short stories as well that were kind of like in a shared world with it.
Yeah. Oh, and David Drake and Eric Flint's Belisarius series. That's based on the Eastern Roman Empire, sort of after the Western Empire's kind of fallen or about to fall, and it's basically this massive invasion by the Indian subcontinent, which never actually happened, but it's just this really, really fun military thing. You know, David, when you were talking about George, I mean, for us, Stormlight Archives, it reminded me, I was reading this book on Herodotus, the historian, and he's talking about how the Greeks would actually fight each other with the Persian army, like across the battlefield. Like they would start, you know, going back and forth with each other, because the only people that Greeks hated more than Persians was other Greeks. And so that was, it kind of reminded me of that. I'm pretty sure he drew on that a little bit.
I'm surprised we've gotten an hour into this discussion. Well, almost an hour into this discussion, and this is the first time Drake has come up, because I mean he's actually kind of the quintessential military fiction author. Come to think of it.
Yeah. Gene, what about you? What books influenced your desire to write military?
You know, you mentioned the Bridge Burners, and that was actually a really big one for me. I read the Malazan books way back in my early 20s, and just I love the camaraderie between them. And then as they start splitting off into doing their own things as the book progresses, just seeing who are these people when they're not together and versus when they are together, and how do they function individually versus being on a team. That was super interesting to me. The other thing that I actually really love is the movie, The Seven Samurai. The story of the dedication, to people they didn't even know, saving a village they didn't even know really, and just the heart that was in it really has stuck with me.
Have you watched the various retellings of that one?
No, I've just seen the original.
Magnificent Seven, Battle Beyond the Stars, and then they remade Magnificent Seven as well recently. But yeah, that's kind of a timeless story, and they've done it in the ancient, was it Japan? They've done it in the Wild West. They've done it in space. It's a good tale.
Yeah, it is a good tale, and it triggers the heart. The emotions of why do we protect things? What's the reason?
Very interesting. And Angel, what about you?
Other than yours? Other than Shields and Shadow, it would be Daniel Aronson's Kingdoms of Sand. Because it is probably 90% at least battle. And it's just really hard hitting, and it's completely real. I've seen some reviews complain that people are vomiting and it gets a little too much realness. I'm but that's what happens. I like seeing that. Let's go all out.
Yeah. Actually, one of my better readers criticized me because in the entire first book, no one gets blood in their eyes. And so there was a scene in the first battle of the second book. I'm all right, here's some blood in his eyes. There you go. Happy now. Yeah, it's funny. All right, well, we are pretty much out of time, so why don't we sign off the podcast with everybody telling our viewers, listeners, readers, whatever else you are doing to enjoy the podcast, where to find you and your books. David, why don't we start with you?
Pretty much 100% Amazon, unless you're a listener, and then you can find them on Audible. Just a beautiful narration that I cannot say enough about for Fate Marked. And I am not one to listen to my books. I do not like to hear my own words spoken out loud, but I made an exception for Fate Marked because of how beautiful the narration was.
Wow. Who does it?
It's funny because I was just trying to remember the name. It was 2 years ago, and I'd actually never heard of the guy before. And I'm just going to tell you right now. He is an English guy, though, so you get the benefit of that beautiful English accent. So it's a guy by the name of Derek Perkins, who's done a lot of kind of historical and epic type fantasy other books, including ones by Duncan Hamilton, who's another pretty awesome.
Okay, yeah, I was listening to his books. That's a great narrator voice. Very cool. Matt.
Well, you can find me on the very creatively named Facebook account, Matt Gilbert Writer. But you can find my books there on Amazon, and like David, I have Audible versions, and I was actually pretty impressed with the Audible stuff. And that's there's the guy doing it. His name is Ralph Lister. He did a really awesome job. I guess he also did the Malzahn books, actually, come to think of it.
Nice.
So he does a really good job of pronouncing those curse words with vigor, with emotion. So I was very pleased.
Very cool. And Jean.
Yeah, so my books are on Amazon, iBooks, Kobo, Barnes & Noble, all those major online retailers. You can also find me at jeanlowecarlson.com. The first book, Black Mark, is out in audio for Audible and all that stuff. And the other ones are hopefully coming soon, within the next year.
Ooh, exciting.
Yeah.
Angel.
You can find me on angelhaze.com, where you can get the free short story. And I actually have Blood of Vengeance is the first book's coming out for free. I think in two weeks. Yes.
That's a good price too.
Well, it just on BookFunnel, it's going to be free for about 5 months.
Very cool. And you guys all know where to find me. We will be back Thursday night with James Quinlan Maservi, I think his name is. If I butchered his name, James, I apologize in advance. Stevie will be back to butcher your name again on Thursday night. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed the show, even if you didn't, hit that like and subscribe button. Have an awesome day. Thank you guys so much for coming.
Thanks.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Now comes the awkward part where we're all kind of like, ah.